Before we jump into this video, I wanted to make a little series update, I guess. There's gonna be a slight change in format and how I'm doing these videos. Nothing major, but it'll probably be noticeable. Reason being is everything I've shown so far is just up to January's progress, and we're like in April right now, so there's about like 2 months of work that I have not shown yet. And this video editing stuff's taking up a lot of time, and I need to kind of speed that process up so it doesn't take up all of my crafting time. Because, I mean, as much as I like to show this stuff, I also want to get it done in time. And it's due in June, so kind of how things were working before was, you know, I'd edit all my B-roll and stuff like that, or my time-lapse videos, and then I would sit and make notes on how everything was actually working, how the process went, any kind of troubles I had, and then I would come down, set up the cameras and everything, and I would just start to record, you know. But because I wasn't really looking at what I was dealing with, there was a lot of different takes and stuff because it didn't sound right, or didn't have enough energy, or didn't have enough reaction to what I was talking about. I'm not gonna say it didn't feel genuine, but it also felt kind of forced, if that makes any sense. But yeah, a recording would take all night, you know. This will hopefully make the recording only take an hour or two tops. So what I'll be doing now is, instead of making all those notes, I'm just taking my B-roll footage. I'm gonna play it on the computer. As I'm recording, I'll talk and edit down everything that way. So it'll be more of like a voiceover with time lapse, maybe some whatever's in between. Less of my beautiful face. But yeah, to give you an idea, I mean, here's pretty much where I'm at right now in terms of, I mean, you can see a lot of stuff done so far. Yeah, and that's a lot of stuff to cover too. So hopefully the way I'm going to be doing this now will speed my process up a little bit. Let me know in the comments if you like the way this is, if not, if it's more boring. I mean, if anyone's watching this crap anyway. But yeah, hopefully this will be a little more organized, maybe. Oh, maybe not organized, but consistent, I think is the word I'm looking for. Alright, on to the show. Alright, so now we're going to talk about the arms. No doubt in my mind this is going to end up being a boring episode, so instead of just covering the base construction, I'm going to cover everything arms. From the gauntlets to the pauldrons, base construction to where I'm at right as of now. Otherwise it's going to be insanely boring. So jump backwards a little bit. In the first episode I said that I was originally going to be using a template for all of this, and then I opted out after I got into the chest piece. Reason being was that most of the pieces were fairly simplistic, like your upper legs, gauntlets, arms. Most of them were basically just cylinders. The Joy Toy figures that I'm basing this on are a little more stylized. I think they're more like updated, so instead of being just basic cylinders, they have like a slight curve to them. If I was to use those 3D models, I was going to have to heavily modify them anyway, so I was like, well, just build them all from scratch like everything else. Oh, jeez. Sable, you trying to get up? Ah, there you go. You doing some cat ASMR? Oh, man, now she's back down. For some reason, I think I forgot to record the base construction out of cardboard for both the gauntlets and the upper arms. And so we'll start with the pauldron first, because I do have video footage of that, and then that'll at least give you like a general idea of how the other two were constructed. Alright, so just like all the other ones, you know, I used my my reference image that I had, which had its 1 foot by 1 foot square markups on it that I already had. Drew those lines out onto the cardboard and then tried to get as close as I could to the actual shape of the pauldrons. Use those squares as reference, cut them all out and all that. Yeah, this was a much easier process than the other ones, mostly because of how simple the shape is of the Pauldrons. So what I did was I used the actual corner of a piece of cardboard and stood them up together, the two front and side profiles together, and kind of did some like weird math with the tape measure to kind of figure out the actual perfect bevel curve for it. Once I did that, just kept adding up more and more pieces, you know, until I got the shape. Wrapped the whole thing in plastic wrap, and again in duct tape, a couple layers. Outlined the whole edge of the thing. Yeah, I gave the back end lip a little extra tape there too, because I figured I was going to need something like of a border to help kind of hold the shape a little bit. In hindsight, it didn't really help that much, but I'll get into that though once I got everything to about where I wanted. Yeah, cut it off, pulled the whole thing off, cut off the excess, and then yeah, just like all the other pieces too, I had to lay this piece down flat. I could have done it much better, and I wish I would have done it better than the way I did it in this one. I just kept cutting lines into it until every high spot laid down flat. I should have done it just in several sections because this looks atrocious. And the end result did not turn out good. Best way to describe it, once I actually started putting things together, the entire curve of the whole thing was kind of warped, because as deep as some of those lines went, I couldn't get my V-cuts in the foam as deep. But we'll get to that too. I'm jumping the gun again. So once I was all out, traced it all to foam. I had to do this 4 times over, both for the inner, outer, left and right. Ended up taking up a lot of foam. I believe this was like 10mm foam too. I wanted it to have some bulk, that way it would kind of help hold its own shape. To do the reverse side, I just flipped the template upside down, made all my markings that I had on the front on the opposite side, just went to town again, same thing all over, tracing it to foam, cutting it out. Yeah, when it came to these like little V-cuts, a little trick I ended up using was, well, not so much a trick, but kind of the technique I tried to use so they wouldn't cut off too early, was that as I was bringing it back closer to the point where the two lines meet, I would angle the blade outward just a little bit, just to try and keep it away from the opening. When you go to glue this together afterwards, I mean, it might not fully contact right there at the end because of that, but it's better that than not having your cut the entire way. Plus, in the end, you can always just fill it with hot glue or something to kind of help fill that void if you're worried about anything coming apart. But I wasn't super worried about it in the end because I knew like all the details on the Pauldron, like the cross and the skull and all that, was going to cover up most of it, even after I do all the cleanup. So it wasn't a huge deal. You know, once it was all cut out, then it just came time for some contact cement, and then putting it all together. This was not a fun task, because even though I had all my registration marks, just there was so many, and you didn't want to start bumping anything together because then it would start sticking, and then, you know, you're pulling foam if you end up hitting stuff the wrong way. It was just a bit of a nightmare, all those little slivers. Like I said, it would have been a lot easier if I just did it in individual slices the whole way across, or something a lot more simple. Like, I take full responsibility for how dumb this was. And it seems like a lot of spots needed like an extra layer of glue. Sometimes the things don't stick that well together. I'll just give it a second coat and put it aside. Usually it seems to be an issue on the thicker foam than the thinner foam. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe just, you know, pulls harder on itself or something. Or I just noticed that. I don't know what the actual reason is. But it seemed like I needed to do it with almost every piece, at least in the longer sections. Yeah, I mean, even though the way I split this template up was kind of terrible, it did kind of offer me a neat way to line everything up. I didn't have to make too many alignment marks down the center because I had so many slits there I could just line them up at those cuts. For the trim, I ended up doing I believe it was 45-degree angle cuts both on the inside and outside. I figured it was going to help hold a little more tension that way. It might have been, I don't know. I don't think either way would have worked, because in the end afterwards it still kind of sprung outward anyway, and I do end up having to trim all this in, which I'll get into once I get there. And then came the fun part of trying to put all of it back together. I mean, the two halves back together. I mean, you can already see right off the bat as I'm pushing it together how it's just lost its shape. It's no longer a smooth round surface, it's just bumpy as hell. I noticed this immediately and I knew I was going to have to do a ton of adjustments. I don't think well, I have a couple theories on as to why it was like this. I don't think it was so much the duct tape template as it was probably more the way I was doing my cuts in the template. So instead of just sectioning everything off in layers, which I think is how I did my Terminator chaplain, this one, since I did all just straight cuts from the center until it started laying flat, I think because I couldn't get those consistently as deep as I needed them to be, I think that might have warped it somehow. But the bend seems fine from the corners out, it's just once it hit the center, everything was inconsistent. And it was inconsistent on both of them in the same spots, so maybe there was some kind of mess up in the template. I mean, duct tape does have a tendency to kind of like curl up, especially with the plastic wrap underneath it, so you really need to kind of like pull it out when you lay it down. Either way, it was a disaster. I shouldn't have done it that way. And I realized that immediately once I went to try and test everything on. Yeah, because I think at the time I only had part of the shins and the chest done, and I went to put them on and they were just way too big. I think what I did was when I was comparing it to my scaled reference, I want to say that I made my model size based on the whole Pauldron, which included the trim and the shields on the top and side. I referenced the entire thing rather than just what was inside. Everything was going to be put onto, so like the bare base of it. I had the same issue with literally everything else. That was all a me problem for sure. Like, I'm trying not to make excuses for myself, but it has been, what is it, like 3 years now since I've done like a full ground up costume from scratch. So I'm still rusty on a lot of my methods that I used to use. Like my Terminator chaplain was kind of like at my peak artistically, and I kind of honed in a lot of my methods for these big builds on my Raynor suit, and then like everything that I had learned from that went into the chaplain and the Nier Automata robot. So here I'm kind of like relearning everything since it's been a while. It's slowly coming back to me, but you know, live and learn, I guess. But of course that meant I needed to trim everything down and fix that terrible wave in the center. I started by marking the outside edge of how much I actually wanted to take off, both the bottom and in the back side. I can't remember exactly how much. I want to say it was probably like 1.5 inches to 2 inches. I split the whole thing down the middle, and I tried to almost like freehand some of that. In the end it didn't work as well as I wanted, but the idea was I wanted it to start almost straight from the bottom and then curve as it went up, so I kind of took a roller and just made that straight to start at the bottom just to get that curve a little better. I had took a note of the two major humps that were in it so I could mark them down to figure out where everything needed. In the end, after doing this and gluing it back together, it didn't come back as well as I wanted, but it did get rid of some of it. After I'd cut off that excess foam from the top and bottom too, to try and bring the size of it down, I made brand new trim pieces to try and help pull everything in together a little more than it was before. By the end it was still a little too wide in the there was still some issues with some bumpiness along the center. So I repeated that process again. This time I think to try and get like a better straight line from top to bottom, I took a long piece of painter's tape, like 1/2 inch painter's tape, and I ran a piece from the top to the bottom to try and get as smooth of a straight line down the center to try and get rid of that waviness. For the most part, I think that got rid of most of it, if not all of it. But I did end up going deeper and deeper as well. I don't know how many times I actually did end up cutting the center out. It's kind of amazing how much I actually did take off in the end. Yeah, but once I ended up putting everything together, after all that, it did end up kind of like creating a weird V shape on the inside, especially at the top. So I did the same thing with the painter's tape again. I ran it from the top and tried to find a good center line to get it to go from the corners to the top without anything being uneven. I ended up taking a good chunk out of that too. And then the piece that I cut off, I just used it as reference for the next two. That way I could keep everything consistent. Flipped it inside out and traced it onto the next piece and then the other piece. But yeah, for how much foam I took off, that was kind of surprising that they're not even smaller than they actually are now. Especially considering, I mean, in the end I did putting a lot of extra stuff onto them. But for the most part, that bevel was mostly gone. Still a couple small spots here and there which I ended up taking care of. Alright, so before I show any more of the Pauldron, I gotta show everything I'm going to be connecting it to, which will be the arms. So we will start from the ground up, or from the wrist up rather. Alright, so like I said, I forgot to completely record the actual construction of the cardboard model for this one. So we're going to start off with me actually just tracing the template out. Yeah, so the template was only half a piece, so once I traced it, I had to flip it upside down, do the inverse, and then do the exact same thing again for the other hand. So the two pieces were kind of the exact same thing, just backwards, I guess. But if you look at the individual pieces, you can see, just like with the leg, I have everything labeled like R1, R2, R3, L1, L2, L3. That's just so I know what's at the top and what numerical order they go into each other. So like the top piece would be 1, second piece would be 2, 3, as it goes down. Once it was all traced out, came time for gluing and putting it all together. You can kind of see I laid all the pieces on top of each other just to kind of keep them in order, because it gets kind of confusing, especially with these ones, where your 1, 2, 3, and 4 goes. So I kind of laid them out on the table in those orders. Yeah, one neat little trick when you're gluing things like this together, and before you actually get to the very end of wrapping the whole thing around, I'll bend a piece both forward and backward to try and get as much pressure on those corners of the piece that's glued together, just to get as much extra push on it as I can, because once your piece starts getting so long, you can't really like grab the center and push it. But what you can do is you can kind of bend it and get it to really push on those two corners, you know what I mean? If you do that both inward and outward, it can really get both the in and out edges really pressed together. Maybe not so much the middle, but enough for it to actually hold. And then when it comes to that very last piece, you know, you can actually fit your hands around the whole thing enough to press everything evenly. And that's the gauntlet. And for the upper arms, it was the same exact thing. Same template process as everything else so far. Cutting it out, gluing it together, making sure all my alignment marks match up. A lot of these pieces I gave 2 coats just because this gray foam is your Harbor Freight foam, and it doesn't seem to stick that well together. Well, it does, but for some reason it usually requires 2 coats. I don't know if it just absorbs the contact cement a little better, or yeah, just like the gauntlets then, just to make sure I got everything pressed together as good as I can. When I had to make sure I folded everything forward and back to try and get that one line just to press as hard as it can in every direction. But yeah, gauntlets and upper arms went together super easy. They were probably the easiest things in the whole build so far. Little did I know that it was going to end up being the most tedious, but we'll get to that. So at this point I was starting to look at how I was going to actually start mounting all this stuff together. I knew I was going to need to have at least some kind of strap on the shoulder of the chest piece for the arm to hold on to. And on my Terminator Chaplain, the shoulder is its own separate piece from the bicep, from the upper arm. And it doesn't need to be. It can be one solid piece. So instead of modeling something out, I decided what I would do was I would just take the shoulder from the chaplain, take it off, bring it over to the table, make a template from that. So what I did was I got a bunch of duct tape, ran it on the inside. I originally was going to run the outside and realized I would make it bigger. So I ran it on the inside of this to make it a hair smaller, just to get that shape. And then I did the same exact thing as if it was a regular duct tape template. Cut off the excess, started making all my cuts to try and lay down flat. Made notes of what was actually the top, side, and bottom, that way I didn't mess anything up. The end result looks pretty ugly, but it doesn't matter because it's more of a functional piece than a visual piece. This part of the body is not going to be seen. This is what's going to be inside the pauldron. It's more of a mechanical piece for me to keep everything kind of held together. So I wasn't too concerned about how it looked. And because of that, I think I ran out of my 10mm foam and my white foam, and then I'm using some leftover Harbor Freight foam for it. So one half's white, the other half's gray, two different thicknesses, but it doesn't matter because it's not going to be seen. And once I had everything glued together, I knew I was going to need a backing piece, or a backing piece, to kind of help it hold its shape a little bit. So I took the shoulder piece I had from the Terminator Chaplain and just traced that again. Once that was glued on, I kind of put it up against the chest piece to kind of get it a good size reference, to make sure everything was okay. I did realize that it was a hair too big, so I had to cut it down too. Which is fine. I mean, making things a little too big, it's a lot better than making things too small, because you can always cut off rather than add to. Especially when it's a simple shape like this. We'll cover the elbow then. So for the elbow plate, right now it's not attached to anything. I still, depending on how I edit this, I still have it on its own. It will probably be attached right to the upper arm, and it won't move at all. I don't think that's going to cause any problems for me visually, but I'll wait until I have the upper arm detailed before I start attaching them. So the process I did for that was I just took some tape and taped the upper and lower arms together, and then made a paper template and wrapped it around the whole thing, trying to get an idea of the bevels and everything that I needed. This was super easy to make. Made sure that I gave everything like a 45-degree angle cut, because it was going to be, well, was it 45? It might be 45. Yeah, they're both 45s, which you would think would turn the whole thing into a 90-degree angle, but I think the curvature of it kind of helps pop some of that out. But it did work out pretty good the first time around. I don't think I had to do any trimming on this, at least not yet. And it was also super easy to put together. There was no stress points, nothing was super big or anything. Once I kind of had everything assembled, I came to the conclusion that everything was just way too big. I had done a couple test fits. I think I posted some videos might have been on both Facebook and YouTube. I checked them out, and some people were like, yeah, it looks fine. Your arms don't look that big or that fat. But I knew that I was also going to have to add details to them, so like all the plating and stuff on the gauntlets and the upper arms, like all the extra plating and stuff that was going to be on them, that was going to bulk them up more, so I needed to cut them down. So to get a little bit of a baseline, I took the arms from the Terminator Chaplain and made a reference how tall they were, because those arms fit really good on me.
it's kind of cheating to have that right there so I could just kind of match everything up, but it worked and it did what it needed to. It gave me the reference I needed. Around that time I realized I might have messed up my gauntlets when I was doing the assembly. I still to this day don't know what I did. I think it was just a mislabel and I didn't mess anything up at all, but I had trouble finding a line when I was matching my cut from one piece to another and trying to match everything up. It was a bit of a headache. You can kind of see here in the video, I'm just constantly spinning the two around and over and over and over again, driving myself nuts, trying to figure out where it was at, and then I just realized, you know what, screw it. Just find a similar starting point and just go from there. Whatever I did, they're both fine. Like, it's weird. Like, they're both the same shape, it's just the lines seem different for some reason. So another thing I had to do was, I'd already cut down the shoulder previously, but I realized that if I was going to bend my arm out, that was going to start kind of like interfering with things. So I had to kind of change the angle of that corner so it had some flex, so it could go in different directions. And a straight flat wall up against that was not going to cut it, because then that would cause points to bind. So I kind of brought that in a little bit, and then I knew I was only going to need like one elastic strap in the top shoulder, so I cut a small hole in the top of the chest piece, ran a clip and some nylon threading through, and just hot glued the crap of it on the inside. And then, since I'd already tested out where I wanted everything with the arms next to the body, I knew I wanted that clip to be at the very peak of the shoulder piece, because of previously how I had cut down the shoulder piece to kind of bring everything, to bring the arm up to where I wanted it in terms of height. I glued in the nylon threading there, or the nylon strap, and then ran the other half of the clip through there, so now I can just unclip the shoulder from the body whenever I want. If you're kind of new to hot glue, which is, I think all cosplayers are very familiar with hot glue and how hot it is, you can, touching it obviously can lead to blisters and lots of pain. A little thing I learned a long time ago was that if you just wet your finger beforehand, you have 2 to 3 seconds of touch on that. It creates a nice little barrier. Usually what I'll do is I'll lay down my hot glue, and then I'll lick my finger or put my finger in water, and then I'll press down the hot glue into the crevices of where I'm at. So if I'm trying to do along the side of the nylon threading, I'll try and actually press it in there to make sure it is conforming around that as tight as possible. And if you let it dry on its own, obviously it's going to do the same thing on itself, but it's more of a time saver, because I want that to be dry so I can, start doing something else, let it sit so it doesn't, so that the hot glue doesn't run or something like that. Plus, when you do that too, that also kind of shock freeze is the wrong word, but it kind of shock cools the very outer layer of the hot glue, so that even if everything underneath it is still hot, that surface is now cold enough that it's going to hold its shape, so that the inside stuff is still kind of doing its thing, but the outside is going to hold its shape, so there's nothing's going to run if you decide to put it aside. It's not going to run down the edge or something like that. So that's a nice little hot glue pro tip. Get a cup of water, or just drink a lot of water and keep a wet tongue, and just keep your finger wet, and then just give it a good press or two, and that'll help dry the hot glue a little bit faster, or at least fast enough to let you work with it a little better instead of waiting. After that, I attached the shoulder to the upper arm, and then I started repeating the process to attach the upper arm to the lower arm. I glued in the nylon threading and all that fun stuff. Yeah, so I don't have any footage of this particularly, but when it came to getting the actual length of what I needed between the two, what I did was, so I had just glued the loop of nylon threading with the clip on the upper arm, and then the lower arm I just glued the nylon strip, and then when I went to try everything on, I tried to figure out the height by running the bottom's nylon strip through the clip, to figure out how far up and down I wanted it. And once I had it where I wanted, I just separated it from the clip on the top. That way I now had the top and bottom clip separated. And then I took the gauntlet off, set it aside, and then I was able to figure out, oh, okay, that clip's right there on the thread, the rest of this needs to lay down flat, glue it to that. Now I have a reference for how long it needs to be on all the pieces. It's kind of hard to, I mean, it's not hard to explain, but I wish I had a video of it to kind of help visualize. But once I had those glued down, then I checked the bend of the elbow to make sure, you know, I actually had some decent flex for the arm, which meant I had to cut out a lot of elbow room, both on the gauntlet and the upper arm. It still doesn't have a ton of movement, but we'll get to fixing that here in a second. Because after trying everything on, I realized that everything was still way too big. I had to bring in like the whole size of the arms. They were way too bulky and way too big. It wasn't just an issue with the binding with the elbow. It was it was a scaling issue. It was a fitment issue. The upper arm barely fit inside the pauldron, which I wanted to be snug, but at the same time, I need things to have some movement. So I want to say at first I took about, I want to say, a 1/4 inch off both the front and back. Just taking a ruler and measuring out from the center line where the actual, from where the original split was. And I brought that in, glued it together, put it all back together, tried it on to make sure everything looked well together with each other. Yeah, while I was waiting for that to dry, I tried for one more small fix on the pauldron just to get that bulge out. So this time around, instead of just using a string of duct tape, I used 2 metal rollers, and I actually taped them to the pauldron, and then I marked out exactly where that was. And I ended up cutting out the inside, and then I made a template on the inside of where the 2 metal rollers were, and then that was going to be my new piece that I was going to put in. This actually did work. This got rid of the whole bump, and it made the entire thing a nice smooth curve. Even looking at it, I see almost nothing. There's maybe a real tiny bump here and there, but it's practically gone. Well, once I fixed that, then came time to double check everything one more time. So I threw the chest piece up on the table and ran the arms and the pauldron up there just to make sure the size and scale was right. I brought up some reference images to make sure to see how low the actual pauldron went to the chest piece, how high it was on the chest piece. Everything seemed great in terms of scaling. I finally got it honed in after what felt like weeks, but it was, I don't know, it's probably like a weekend of just messing with it. At that point then, I knew I needed to make some inner borders and everything too, so I just took a bunch of random scrap paper, taped it all together, taped it to the inside of the pauldron, and I just started testing everything out to figure out what size and shape I actually needed. This led to another goof where I made it too deep, because after I put everything on, I realized that the upper arms still were not fitting well inside that pauldron, and I was going to need to make both the trim on the inside and the bottom to be about the same exact size. As in terms of the reference images, it's the same thickness the whole way around. So to get a little more out of my side, I needed to shrink the upper arm some more. I think I took another full ½ inch to a full inch off of that and shrunk it down, just split it straight up the front or straight up the side, just to bring everything in. And that ended up being enough of what I needed, but that was when I realized that I think I had maybe 3.5 inches on the inside for the trim, but even after all that cutting, the bottom trim would only get me about 2 to 2.5 inches, I think. So I meant I had to bring in the inside trim of the pauldron, which meant ripping off everything I had done and glued, and that was not fun at all. At least at that point I knew how much space I had on the bottom. So I did the same exact process for the bottom first. Figured I put the bottom on, that way I knew how much space I had, and then that was going to be my standard for how much I'd have around the inside. So it was the same thing, bunch of scrap paper, drew an outline of the pauldron, took a roller, measured how much everything would have been, then used my paper template, transferred it to foam, cut it out, glue it on. I also had to kind of shrink down the top too, because I wanted it to be a perfect circle, or to be perfectly circular, and the very tip had a bit of a peak to it, and that wasn't going to fly, so I made sure I rounded that down first just to get the shape that I wanted. Yeah. So at that point I was going to need something to let the actual shoulder piece rest on for the pauldron. Otherwise it was just going to sink the whole way down and be lopsided. It needs something to rest on to hold a certain position. So took some scrap paper, made sure I got the contour of the inside of the pauldron right, and then kind of got an idea of how far I needed everything to be from the from the shoulder, and then made a mark on that, and then just referenced the curvature of the shoulder piece itself. Yeah, I want to say on my first try I nailed the shape and size of it pretty good. The shoulder fit in good, the pauldron had a good hang, it didn't want to sag or anything like that. Yeah, then after that came time to finally rip off the old outer trim, or the older inside trim, which was a pain in the butt because at that point I had everything kind of glued together. There was like 3 layers of foam, just, it was a nightmare. But I knew it needed done because there was no, any kind of adjustment I'd do to what was already existing was gonna look terrible, and I didn't want to mess with that. I was like, I might as well just start over with it, so just deal with ripping it off, because once you put something new on, it's not going to be seen anyway, so just do it. It was frustrating, I didn't want to do it, but these pauldrons were a headache the entire way through so far, and to me it was just another headache I had to deal with, and I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to deal with it. But on the bright side, this time around, everything came out fine. It was the right thickness. Everything lined up. From there I started putting some of the trim on. I figured to make everything easier on myself, I'd make the trim as thick as a roll of duct tape, which I think is about 2 inches, which is about what I wanted anyway. So I just ran a roll of duct tape the whole way along the edge, making sure everything laid down flat so I could just make a whole template based on that. I made one whole side a whole piece, that way it'd be easier to take off, and then when it came time, if I needed to make any adjustments in terms of cutting anything short, it was just, I could go just based on the center line and then just cut it right there. I laid the duct tape template down on some like real thin 4 or 5 millimeter foam, and then use that as my template because I knew I needed this thing to be as sturdy as possible when it came to being an actual template rather than being a real flimsy piece of tape. And then I transferred that to my 10 millimeter foam. That way I had some kind of consistency between them all because I wanted these things to be straight lines. Then gluing everything down was fairly easy to deal with. After I glued everything down, I kind of examined the reference images, and the shielding on the pauldron had like, it wasn't just on the trim, it extended out past a little bit. So I figured I would make that little bit of extra first. That way when it went to make the actual shielding as well, that could then be its own separate piece that I could put on. So this was kind of like a preemptive setup for that. So I kind of measured up from the corners. I think it was like 6 inches. Weird little thing, but I don't know how to explain it, but there's a lot of 6s in this build. A lot of like measurements that I needed all came out to 6s. It's a lot of 6s, but I don't know if it's like a weird little inside joke that I started playing for myself. But yeah, there was. But it's not the first time or the last time that I had a lot of like weird 6-inch measurements. So while I was waiting for those pieces to dry, I knew that one centerpiece in the center that was holding the pauldron up on the shoulder wasn't going to be enough. So I made similar pieces onto the sides of it to kind of give the whole top rounded piece a bit of extra support. Plus I knew I was going to need something for my elastic straps to hold on to, because the original idea was I was going to have the straps for the pauldron to attach to the body piece, but that wasn't giving me what I wanted in terms of both the height, flexibility, and the straps that are ran through the side, and I didn't want that. I wanted these to be I didn't want you to see a whole lot. I didn't want you to see a whole lot of like the mechanics. So my second idea was to have the pauldrons attached via elastic straps to the shoulder. And this actually turned out really good because, one, the elastic would allow it to have a little bit of wiggle, but at the same time, being attached to the shoulder, it wouldn't bind up with anything, and I would have a lot more arm movement. So I made these two extra pieces inside to actually act as both guides and mounting points for the elastic straps. I can't remember exactly how I did this, but I got an idea of where I wanted the holes to be inside the shoulder. Because what I did was I ran an elastic strap from those, and I was going to have them go into the top of the shoulder and then clip into the top of the shoulder, because that top of the shoulder doesn't touch my shoulder. So I would have a lot of actual wiggle room where it wouldn't even touch me. So that would allow me to put the pauldrons on the arms beforehand, before I even attached the arms to the body. And the way I ended up finding out the right length for them was the same as before. I glued one end first to the inside of the pauldron of the elastic, and then I ran the elastic through the pauldron, or through the shoulder, as I had the shoulder up where I wanted it to be. Once I had the strap inside the shoulder, I wrapped it around a clip and then ran that back through, because what I wanted to dangle enough that I could get it into the arm, like into the shoulder, and then I could clip it into the shoulder. So once I got it at least a decent amount, like maybe like 2 inches or something like that, 2-3 inches, I then outlined where the clip would be, and then from that point, I think I just I glued a strap onto the bottom half to the inside of the shoulder, and then I was able to figure out how long I needed everything to be up inside the pauldron. It's such a complicated mess of super simplicity. It makes me feel stupid for even trying to describe it, because it was a weird process. But it worked, and that's what matters. That's all that matters, is that it works. And because it's elastic, it allows the pauldron to have a little bit of wiggle and bounce, but not too much to make it seem comical or lightweight. And it also moves with the arms, and it's snug but not too snug. Getting these arms where I wanted them was probably the biggest time sink, just because of how much fidgeting and fixing it all took. But finally gave it all a final test fit just to see how it all would work together, and it was perfect. I think the gauntlets still need brought in a little bit now that I brought the upper arms in some, but it's looking so much better. In hindsight, I might have to bring the pauldrons down just a hair. But if I bring the pauldrons down, that also means I want to bring the rest of the arms down with it. Because if I bring the pauldrons down even like an inch, it's going to start covering up too much of the upper arms, and I want some of the upper arms to be seen. It's a weird little dilemma that I got to fight with to try and figure out. So the arms are by no means done yet. They still need a couple tweaks here and there. Not a ton. I'm going to start making a checklist for it. Definitely I want to bring the arms down just a little bit more to get the pauldrons down just a hair. But I might wait until I put the shielding on those pauldrons just to make sure that they are up as high as I want, because it could be an optical illusion and they might seem too high because there's no shields on them, because that is my worry, is that the shields, once I put them on, are they going to be too high and they might interfere with things. So I want to get those shields on first on the pauldron and then test fit it again to see, what hits what in what angles to make sure everything is where I want it to be. And then I'll make my decision, do I drop the arms? I'm out of coffee. Alright, so this covered the arms. Why no hands yet? As far as the hands go, I am in a little bit of a dilemma on how I'm going to do that. I have a couple different ideas. Idea one, I just steal the hands off of the Terminator Chaplain and just use those. That's a possibility. I could do that. But does that run me the risk of pulling my Pauldrons up and pulling, you know what I mean, and making me have the little T-Rex hands? Not so much, but they would still be kind of short. Option 2 is to have fake hands. So the idea would be with that, I'm going to have a weapon in both hands. I need to be able to hold those. So would I make the hands on those weapons and have them be fake and have that all be one thing? Then just have like a handle inside the hand that I could then hold in the gauntlet. And then I'm leaning towards that a little bit, but my fear then is that what kind of range and mobility would I have in terms of swinging a sword or the gun? Like, what kind of wrist motions would I have? Because my wrist would be farther up from the real wrist, you know what I mean? It's definitely something I'm going to wait until I start building the weapons to see. I'm not pushing it back, but I'm just waiting till I have more stuff done to kind of figure out if that is what I want to do. But as far as the arms go, that's where they are right now. Next episode, I'm going to try and get caught up with everything else and start talking about the rest of the fitment I did with everything else. That would be adjusting the feet, getting the shins to work with the legs, getting the legs attached to the hips, maybe a couple extra little details, and that should hopefully get me close to caught up to where we are now. But yeah, hopefully we get to do some detailing soon, but it's going to be a while still. I'm currently sitting at 2 months to go on this project. As of recording, this is like very early April, and the convention I'm making this for will be in the second week of June. So I still have 2 months to go. We are 3 months into the project, so hopefully I'm over the hump of all the hassles I was getting with, and it was mostly in the fitment. I mean, I ran into so many problems of just getting everything to fit together proportionately, which will be what I cover in the next episode. So, you know, stick around for that if you're interested. I mean, builds are always neat to watch, especially when you're fumbling through it like me. But it's all coming back to me slowly. Till the next one.